So today I'm going to be speaking about the theme of the scapegoat complex and scapegoating dynamics. And following my talk, we'll have a role play, which is similar to the role plays that I do in my monthly second Friday of the month supervision group and in ORI supervision classes, where I will pay the therapist and the other person presenting plays patient and gets inside of their patient. So in this case, Laura Dawes will be playing patient who will bring up some of the themes of complex. And from there, of course, we can have discussion and questions, as well as any questions about the programs at the end. So welcome. I'm the founder and executive director of the Object Relations Institute, which we began in 1991. Dr. Robert Weinstein at that time was a co-founder with me, and he's retired. And I've been the executive director for all 32 years or so that we've been in existence since 1991. And we have programs in full candidate programs and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, as well as 1- and 2-year programs and course individual courses. There was in the chat about if you have any knowledge, put in that for Dr. Ina Rosen, administrator, who's handling the things here. Okay, so I want to begin with our talk on the scapegoat complex, and then as I go into it, if there are any questions, we'll take them. But I think it's best to take them after the role play. If otherwise you raise your hand earlier, I'll try to call on you, but I'm going to be just talking. Okay, so the object, I'm giving my object relations view of the scapegoat complex, but I wanted to give credit to Sylvia Piera, who in 1932 published a Jungian book on it. And she looked at the perspective of the collective unconscious as well as the individual unconscious. And with the therapeutic work, it's only along the same line our object relations work. And just as I've written about the demon-lover complex and about the demon-lover archetype in the Jungian perspective, I also the acknowledgement of the scapegoat archetype that the Jungians speak about. And when she wrote about it, she came first from the perspective of how there was a agreed upon ritual that can be seen in the Bible and that can be seen in spiritual dimensions related to a community having a literal goat to take all their sins and all the bad stuff within them and be the acting outside the community to support the collective. But in that case, there's the accuser has a spiritual godlike quality, and the goat is in a submission that also is fantasized, at least, to be a willing surrender to the role of taking on all the sins of the community in order to preserve the intactness of the community. But in the scapegoat complex that we see, or scapegoat dynamics that we see in our patients when they come from scapegoating families, the family is forcing a child into the role of the scapegoat. There's no willing surrender. And the denial of aggression, the denial of sexuality, the denial of desire, all is part of projecting to preserve the family in a pathological. It's a totally logical closed system. And that closed system is internalized in the scapegoat. And it's also part of voters' persecutory psyche is also part of that closed system. And scapegoat is in the psyche of the scapegoater and vice versa. And the scapegoatee, who's the scapegoat, is forced to merge in with and incorporate the psyche of the scapegoater. And what might seem like guilt being put on the child is not guilt, but is persecutory terror. So in terms of Melanie Klein's positions of the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive position, there's no guilt to the level of position. It's persecutory anxiety and the schizoid position of retaliation from the other that can be at the level of the terror of annihilation. Now, the fear of annihilation is particularly because we're talking about a developmental arrest where there's a disruption and abortion of the developmental progress towards being a separate autonomous self. And there are different levels of that. We can look at the schizoid, narcissist, and borderline character disorders as in somewhat different ways on the surface, but the underlying thing is always the same, of having unwanted parts of the parent put into the child. In Ronald Fairbairn's terms, it's the child being forced. What is someone trying to say something there in the chat? I don't know. What was anyway, the scapegoated child is co-opted from the beginning to think like the persecuted parent. And in Ronald Fairbairn's terms, it's like child who, what? Yes, I know I'm quoting Fairbairn. Said that. Ronald Fairbairn talks about look. Oh, okay, I'll speak louder. I'm not open to people talking to me through the chat at this time. There's some concern about the spotty sound, though, so I will try to speak loudly. I don't know why the sound isn't good. That's my department. Ina, you can see what's going on there. So the Ronald Fairbairn's poison pie, when the child is totally dependent, absolutely, on the parent, and the only food in the house is the poison pie the kid is forced to eat. That's one of Fairbairn's examples. It's 90-50%. But that's the same thing with the scapegoat complex, that the child is forced into viewing himself as the bad one because that is what's being into him, an agenda of the parent. And since all aggression has to be denied and self-assertion is impossible, everything is dissociated around aggression and desire, sexuality. And I find this disruptive with people putting things in the chat now. Please wait later. If the sound is a problem, I hope Ina will be aware of that. So the scapegoat is a child who is forced into a pathological system and never internalize a good enough environment or parents in order to develop a self-developmental arrest, and there's constant splitting. So they're a part of, everyone's either good or bad, and in order to be good, you have to someone else to be bad. There's constant blaming in the family of the scapegoat who's bad, and sometimes there's one particular scapegoat that everyone blames. So in order to be good, you have to accuse the other of being bad. And in order to have anger, which is not owned, it can be acted out all the time, but it's excused by the persecutor as being the result of the child being bad. So anger is excused by the other being assumed to be bad, and the scapegoatee takes this on, and takes on the belief that they are bad in order to placate all-powerful parent. And the placating is all part of staying merged into the identity of the parent, which and forecloses. Also, there can be moral defense of blaming the self to rationalize the parent's blame because of the total dependence of the parent. So this is I'm not answering the questions now. Please refrain. If you, Ina just said if there are sound difficulties, that it's because of your internet being slow, apparently. So look at your internet. Okay. So the scapegoatee is constantly incorporating the hostile accusations of the scapegoating parent or sibling. It's very interesting to know that in the case of Melanie Klein, in her own family, the scapegoating dynamics were going on all the time. And Melanie Klein colluded with her mother to scapegoat her sister, Emily. And that was how she got to try to be the good one, by scapegoating her sister and seeing her as being, the mother was seeing Emily as being worthless, promiscuous, all kinds of things that she split off from her own unconscious. And Melanie went along with the mother to condemn the sister. That's how she tried to be the good mother. So at that point, before analysis with Abraham, before any of her work in psychoanalysis, Melanie Klein was putting family into the scapegoating system and acting out that paranoid schizoid dynamic. Now, Fairbairn knows about the false self because he was schizoid, and the schizoid scapegoat is the one who most shows the false self as a cover-up for the veiled hostility. So you have a constant splitting, you have projective identification, and primitive idealization, primitive devaluation, and primitive demonization. You also have the passive aggressive tactics that the scapegoat uses to avoid, because it can't express aggression directly, there's always a threat of retaliation. And there's extreme abuse of retaliation, both verbally and physically often, but this emotional retaliation. And it, given that there's no ability to have self-assertiveness, or in Masterson's view, self-activation, because there's no self that's gone through separation, individuation, you get a constant just reactivity of the accusatory attacks being turned against the self or against another if the scapegoat is scapegoating someone else. So the persecutor is as developmentally arrested as the child scapegoat, and as an undeveloped, valued, and demonized child inside of them. So the lack of development also is a lack of the development of feminine. We see this very much in the work of Emily Dickinson, and valued feminine, and the hyper masculinized identification with the father to avoid identifying with the mother, who is valued feminine. And you, at the end of her life, she wrote the poem, my life has stood a loaded gun. I can kill, but I cannot die, meaning she couldn't surrender. I talk about this in my book, The Compulsion to Create, where I have a large study on Emily Dickinson. But you see the lack of development of the child's self is a lack of vulnerability and a lack of the feminine. And there can be a rigid and a masculine compensation. Emily Dickinson is trying to compensate by an intellectual identification with the father to avoid her being identified with the mother, who is schizoid and devalued and not intellectual. So, and in the family of the schizoid patient, you can see some of the most extreme expressions. So there's someone that I treated for many years who developed totally out of the schizoid personality, but in the beginning, everything was closed off into a deadness, but in the deadness, he visualized himself through the painting of the scream, just a constant scream inside, because he couldn't get out. He couldn't express anything from within of his true self. And of course, later the deadness turned into rage and wanting to kill everyone. And then there was a lot of, self-hate, rage, and avenge. Holding environment allowed him to develop ultimately to become a very loving and related person. But in that family, he was definitely the scapegoat. He was being abused, with the other kids downstairs didn't hear any of it. And from the time he was small, his mother had him in a state of terror, and he had to be totally compliant with the mother. And even if he showed his fear, he would be slapped by the mother. So he had to be totally in the position of a slave to the mother. James Masterson talked about the master slave in the schizoid personality. So you can see in the scapegoat things. And the alternative to being the slave and placating the other and submitting would be to be without a mother. So that's the terror in the schizoid, as Masterson also talks about exile, or else the masters. That is all part of this. So there's any kind of, there's no development of agency, so there can't be self-assertion. And any attempt at that is severely punished with the accusatory rebuke that the kid or the scapegoat is bad. The kid is seen as the seed or Rosemary's Baby, and everything based on those terms, that whatever abuse comes from the parents, or the siblings, it's rationalized as because the child is bad. There's another schizoid personality I wrote about in a case in my book, The Anatomy of Regret, also a case of Karen in my seventh book, my latest one, Developmental Mourning, Erotic Transference, and Object Relations Analysis. So in the case of Sharon, she would talk about the mother being totally out of control with rageful screaming, but the mother would never acknowledge that she had any anger. She would only say the kid was bad. So whatever she did was okay. She could be as abusive as she wanted because the kid was rationalized as the kid is bad. And so any self-expression has to be stifled. The persecutor of the scapegoat has to be placated, or any opposition later in life where the kid becomes stronger has to be passive aggressively hidden or hidden behind a false self. And the self-assertion is seen as the crime in itself. So there can't be a self, and there can only be a reactive. I'm bad if you're good if I'm bad, who's to blame? It's everybody has to. In some families, it's one person blaming another. In some other families, it's one particular scapegoat blamed all the time. And the whole family system relates to that child being scapegoat. And in the dreams of these patients, you see toilets and garbage cans, and sometimes long lead, huge garbage bins, because that's the persona of the scapegoat. They are the garbage, and they are the toilet. In Melanie Klearn's terminology, you talk about the toilet breast transfer. The therapist being made into the toilet breast. If someone comes in who's a scapegoat, they have to use you that way as the toilet breast to bid all the shit into you, because that's what was done to them. And there has to be a period of their externalizing what was internalized, was ready to implode. So, but then there also has to be movement towards aggression in the form of becoming more conscious of the scapegoat sadism within the scapegoated person. So the move towards healthy aggression can go through the route of retaliatory reactivity that is, Sylvia Pereira talks about this in some of her case examples, about the developmental progress in some patients having healthy aggression has to go through a time where they express cold control retaliation or reactive retaliation, and only later can give up retaliation for self, because they go through more of separation, individuation, and what I call developmental mourning, where there's goes from the rage and the treatment and a sense of a void of the self, which also relates to James Masterson's view of the abandonment depression affects. Going from there ultimately into separation and mourning for the lost mother that was never had, the mourning for the primal love object. So that is the route towards self-information, separation, individuation, relatedness. It's the route towards ultimately towards being able to develop empathy and compassion, or to receive empathy and compassion when that was never known in the beginning. And it's the route towards having an internal life and consciousness itself. Now, in the scapegoat complex, as opposed to just scapegoating dynamics, the person becomes conscious of both the victim and the persecutor parts of them in their internal world. The Jungians took shadow parts. They become conscious of them, but they never totally change the psychic state of this vulnerability to the position. So conscious and have to be able to process consciously of it, even when it's resolved somewhat back into the re-experience it, of course, process. And the scapegoat complex more severe than just scapegoating dynamic. But that's where there's that state of psychic structure in mind that totally change. It has to be conscious of the vulnerability to being the victim of this persecutory disorder. Now, there's a lot of self-hate in the scapegoat. And this can become an ongoing self-deprecative. When the man I was discussing, someone I treated in Scotland, totally online, who went through a total transformation. He had 1 year with his grandmother away from dynamic, that something I drew on again and again to reach that little boy that had some hope at that point. But otherwise there was extreme hopelessness, self-denigration, self-deprivation, and contempt for others. But this was all hidden behind a false self, where he would act out being nice to people. Inside, he would have all this hostility, and he had to placate everyone at the time when his mother would slap him, even if he showed a little fear on his face. So he was forced to placate. When he developed the false self to do that, though, he hated himself for it. When he was in a work situation, he hated working, even though there was a part of the job he liked, because he did a therapeutic role there. But in terms of the organization, he had contempt and hatred, because he had to constantly pretend to be part of it and to agree with people when he didn't, and to placate them and be the false personality. Eventually, when he developed himself, he was able to relate to these people. He actually ended the job after 30 years with a lot of love opening up from his heart. And the song, You Never Know What You've Got Till It's Gone, opening up spontaneously and tears coming as he responded to everyone there, having prepared this party where they also learned about, gave him gifts. He opened up this loving part of him in such a spontaneous way. It almost seemed miraculous knowing him from the past, but it was a result of our therapeutic work. The holding environment is very, very important in the schizoid, in the scapegoat, and in the schizoid, particularly where you have that false self. There's no transitional space developed in any of the character disorders. there's no transitional objects having been used. So the child that is internalized is totally reactive to the original parent and the demonization of the parent. And so the woman I spoke of, who I called Sharon in some cases, she would speak of the mother's binary. Everything was split. Everything was binary in the mother's mind. Developed a disgust for this, but she was also having to mother when she was still in the mother's control. And later on when she was married with her actually second husband, she was shocked when she realized that she was the one throwing out all this dissociated, hostile, contemptuous attacks on her husband. She was in absolute shock because she thought of herself always as a scapegoat. But here she was in a dissociated way acting out the scapegoat, persecutors. And she had to become conscious of this. She's in my book on Anatomy of Regret because she went through a lot about the pain of regret of the damage that was doing to her family, her husband and children. And she mourned and worked through it and integrated to develop her own capacity for self-reflection, to see the tendency in her to do this. And she developed a capacity to, through separation, individuation, and developmental mourning, she developed a capacity to reflect on herself. She developed the psychic space to have psychic dialect, developed of course, with that comes interpersonal space, relatedness, and she developed an internal world that she was aware of, where she felt much more able to access things in a conscious way for her creativity. In the beginning, she just said she wanted to be a pawn. She just wanted to be a pawn because that's how she thought of herself. She had a professional job, but she felt like she was a robot in it. And she was trying to express herself through writing, which is how she came to me in the first place. But she had this sense of being metallic, and which is very common, schizoid, fantasy of metal breastness, the metal body, because everything is so rigid in the feminine self, the child self hasn't gotten into having agency or ability of any kind. She was locked into this scapegoat and scapegoaty situation, victim villain dramas with mother. And she was in shock when she saw herself in a dissociated way acting out the scapegoat or persecutor part, in a very deflecting things that her husband made her aware of. And he got enraged, and they eventually were able to communicate. A very different kind of wife and mother. So there was a whole long healing process. It was in her case, it was a 13-year analysis, and she came 3 and 4 times. In the case of the man in Scotland, it was a once treatment. Yet he did go through, obviously we didn't go into all the details of what one would go into a 3 times a week analysis. But he transformed from the core schizoid personality with a false self into an integrated, related person, as I said, when he opened it. At the end, when he left that job he had hated for so many years and opened up this spontaneous love and creative merging the process, which he was using also and do his creative. So the creativity of the person can open up, but as can sexuality, which is dissociated, all the sexual act is dissociated until the person goes through separation and individuation. And of course, the aggression is associated. So the therapist is going to feel it through projective identification. And as she or he feels it, one can feel pulled into that feeling of being. One can either feel like the mean child self that's being shamed and humiliated and demonized and seen as inadequate or demonized. Or one can feel like the parent, that's where you feel the sadistic side of, like, patient acting out the masochistic side and not directly, but through the projective identification process, accusing you of forcing them or being having sadistic control over them. And but as the therapist becomes aware of the projective identification and introjective identification, she or he can then interpret this as the patient goes to the level of interpretation, in Thomas Ogden's words, where subjectivity begins to develop through the developmental mourning process as the affects of the primitive affects of rage and tremendous sadness and grief all are felt, and the person can tolerate what's inside of them. The capacity, objectivity of self, and for symbolization opens up that wasn't there before. And then there's the subjectivity, the other, that's empathy develops. All of this can be seen in my case. Read about it. Well, particularly you'll see in the case of Sharon, you'll see other dynamics related to this in the closet narcissist I write about. And in my paper, an article of mine on the closet narcissist, I used in the beginning the Woody Allen character, Blue Jasmine. What you see is that when the closet narcissist is no longer identified with the grandiose narcissist, no longer in a state of enthrallment or is abandoned and gets reactive and retaliatory, they then feel they can't survive, which happened with Blue Jasmine. And so if not in a state of enthrallment with the grandiose other and being an extension of them, become the threat. And then they're not having a separate self, they fear for annihilation. So the identification that is a very primitive one at first. And the identification is what locks the person into the closed system. Fairbairn has written about this. Winnicott wrote about it in Object Survival, or about the primitive identification. And the therapist has to survive when things begin to be externalized. That's object survival. To tolerate it to a good enough, relatively good enough degree without retaliating or abandoning the patient. And that's object survival. That allows the person to begin to experience that there's externality, you're beyond their omnipotent control. And then they can start to feel that you exist, you have subjectivity, and this is also the beginning of empathy as well as beginning compassion for this. Because as subjectivity is experienced in the other for the first time, so as a subject felt. So all the things that apply to the development of developmental progress out of developmental arrest and character disorders apply to the scapegoat. And in the narcissist, you get the kind of cold, detached deflection of hostile and inadequate parts of the parent into the one woman who I work with who so much conscious anger and rage now about two narcissistic parents, but with the father who was this, some of this is more explicit later on in her life, when she wanted to pursue education in liberal arts, and her father was a brilliant scientist, physicist. She was totally devalued. He was indifferent to her if she wouldn't be an extension of him. And when she went her own way, he shamed her and humiliated her by telling her she was worthless, a worthless human being. That was what he did her when she was in, and she became the valedictorian of university. It was called a worthless human being by him because she didn't become a scientist. So you see that scapegoating of the deflection of the father's inadequacy feelings, his own undeveloped self put into her. And she was despised and shamed, and the indifference of him to anything that was about what she felt was her true instinctual nature and her true desires for what you wanted to study, for just what you wanted to be. So desire is cut off, and as is not developed. All of the impulses for it are dissociated, and there's just this reactivity that all the character disorders have. Now, in the borderline character, you get the direct, rageful, overt, rageful, you're a shit, you're a moron, you're, just open, despising accusations. And that, and the borderline gets into the merger with the parent in continual sadomasochistic fights and conflicts that, of course, then get put into the therapeutic situation and laid out with the therapist who have to gradually get out of the fighting each time and try to let the person know what's going on that they're reenacting. So the borderline, it's very overt abuse. With the narcissist, it could be detached, contemptuous comments that cut right through the heart, like with that woman and her father. And with the schizoid, there's the false self, but that's the only protection from the faults of the parents. When the gentleman I work with from Scotland, when he was small child, his mother had total tyrannical control over him. And as I said, even if he looked scared, she would take that as a negative mirroring, I think, and assault him. So she would slap him for looking terrified of her. It wasn't even at the level of that he was opposing her. Later, when he became a teenager and he was acting out more overtly, his father started beating him up. So he was a scapegoat for both parents. And what was kind of amazing in that family was how much his other siblings were not even aware of any of this going on, let alone that they were not the chosen scapegoats where the parents were acting out their unconscious pathology on the others that were not. The pathology of the parents was not acted out on the other siblings as it was on the chosen scapegoat. And one of the things that saved this man was, first of all, that year he spent with his grandmother away from the family when he was 3, but also his love for music was where he would find the true self, but that was attacked too viciously by the parents, where he liked music. but his false self was how he protected himself, mainly out in the world. He often got humiliated also at school. But later, as I said, in this job situation, he had at that point an ongoing operating false self. And so nobody knew that he wasn't just this nice guy. Inside, he was contemptuous and despairing, filled with this hopelessness, thinking everything was just for shit in the world. And there was only through therapeutic relationship with me could we open a sense of, and it was very much like, Fairbairn's libidinal ego, being shot down by the anti-libidinal ego. Well, that was internalized early child self with persecutory, scapegoating mother. Jeffrey Seinfeld has talked about the anti-dependence, put it in more common terms as opposed to Fairbairn's libidinal ego and anti-libidinal ego with no central self developed yet, where you just had the pathological splitting and the repetition of the extremes, and hope is killed every time. The libidinal ego's hope is shot down over and over and over by the anti-libidinal ego with the anti-dependence. And so never be changed without a therapeutic process in a holding environment. Now, I also know of families that I've treated. The siblings are all part of scapegoating each other in a very active way. So who's blaming who all the time is up. It's not just one chosen scapegoat, but the children can be blamed, one parent to protect himself against, let's say, the wife's rage or craziness. So in order to hold her intact, you beat the children, or the children blame each other. So there are families like that which have those borderline dynamics. Borderline schizoid narcissistic dynamics can also be mixed up in this kind of character disorder. It's interesting that Queen Elizabeth once said, "Oh yes, we have a lot of those black sheeps in our family. We have those." When somebody was talking about being a black sheep, she said, "Yes, we have quite a few of those black sheep." The scapegoat is the black sheep, and everyone agrees on it because that way they protect their false self-image. And but once the energy is opened up of this, that of all of the parts of the self that have been dissociated, the person can begin to become empowered in a realistic way to have healthy assertion. And along with that, the development of all the ego functions of self-reflection, object constancy, psychic capacity for psychic dialectic, opposed to just monologue and reactivity, and becoming the interpreting subject who knows that they're interpreting things, unlike the arrested person who just reacts and says, "No, that's a fact. You did that." There's no like, "I interpret it this way, you interpret it that way." And only when the person reaches a level through the affects that go on in the developmental mourning process or the abandonment and mourning process, only then can there be actual self-assertion and subjectivity and taking interpretations from the analyst, because one has to know that one interprets things oneself in order to receive interpret and know that the analyst is interpreting and not just attacking or holding them. In the earlier splitting, it's either attacking or holding. It's no meaning, no symbolization, no words. It's just being done to them. So only through the developmental mourning process and separation, individuation, where eventually one moves more into the position and can have ambivalence rather than primitive splitting, and can tolerate anger within a loving relationship and sustain love relationship beyond anger. Only then, and preserve object constancy that way. Only then do you get the ability of the patient to receive interpretation from the analyst. So the interpreting subject needs to develop along with the historical subject, as Thomas Ogden writes about in The Matrix of the Mind, 1986, which is a book that I use each year in our intro object relations course, each about development in the paranoid schizoid and depressive position. So I like his use of the idea of the interpreting subject and the historical subject, because someone developmentally arrested is not a historical subject any more than they're an interpreting subject. They don't sustain the sense of cause and effect and the history of the therapeutic relationship. The minute the split happens, you're gone. Anything good is gone. The therapist may feel a little shocked if you go through this again as you work this kind of, but right away you can become the paranoid comes out in the patient, and you're all, you either seduced them or betrayed them or something, that you had a malignant agenda towards them, and now they know the truth. So the paranoid comes out at the point of the split. And then there's no historical subject. There's no, this happened before with us. And, even though you're angry at me now, don't you remember that a week ago we were talking together about your dream and we were sharing? No, that's all gone. That's gone. So in the moment of the split, you're all bad. And of course, you can also be all bad with the borderline, or all inadequate and incompetent with the narcissist and, devalued. You can, a character assassination in a cold, controlled way may take place with the narcissistic character, but the paranoid split is the same. Whether it's the borderline raging at you that you're a bitch and you have betrayed them and you seduced them or whatever, or it's a narcissist who's slowly taking you apart bit by bit and telling you about everything that's wrong with you and doing a character assassination, or the schizoid will withdraw. But as Melanie Klein shows so clearly in her paper on schizoid phenomena, on the schizoid mechanisms, thinking of Harry Guntrup's book on schizoid phenomena, object relations in the self. But Melanie Klein, in her paper on schizoid mechanisms, showed how when the patient got quiet and withdrew, she would interpret that the patient had gotten angry and there was aggression towards the analyst, and he had to go into hiding. And so she would interpret the aggression that was withdrawn from, and as the schizoid patient withdrew, as a mechanism of protecting themselves. The borderline will attack and fight with you. The narcissist will have cool contempt and indifference, and the schizoid will hide away, hide behind the false self again, show that they don't trust you anymore. So each one has their own particular defense style, but same split is taking place, that primal split into paranoia, and you go into the bad object rather than the original, what might be a part object, either a narcissistic mirroring object or an idealized part object, sometimes a friendship. But at the moment when they experience the old scapegoat attack, and they imagine it coming from you, and whatever they say you're actually doing or not, they will split into a paranoid state and make a whole case against you in their own way. So yeah, so the dreams are very interesting because they bring up this thing about being a toilet, not just having toilets in a dream. But you can talk to a scapegoat patient about that they are the toilet. And of course, I will tell all my patients that every part of the dream, not just people in the dream, are parts of themselves, bunches. So the toilet self, the garbage can self, and the Rosemary baby self, all of that can appear in the dream material. And of course, it's very helpful to have dreams. You can have an inner world that opens up. The schizoid will have a very rich internal world that can open up in dreams because they're going inward all the time. And I find with the schizoid, when I was talking about the man in Scotland, that he was always able to understand what I said about this was inside of him. It wasn't the external world. He got it right away because he knew he lived in the internal world, like Fairburn talked about. Schizoid character lives in the internal world. So if you interpret about this is actually going on inside of you, he would understand it right away. A borderline would never fight you, like want to fight to the death to prove that it wasn't, and nothing's going on inside of them. It's all external. And the narcissist will, they have to value anyone outside in order to maintain a grandiose structure of their selves. In some ways, the easiest person to treat as far as this helping the patient to know about their internal world is the schizoid. No matter how developmentally arrested they are. And I'm going to be finishing up my lecture so we can go into the role play. I could take one or two questions right now, but I do want to go into the role play. And then, but I want to emphasize again that with the scapegoat dynamic, it's always someone has to be bad in order for someone else to be good because there's that primal. So until there's a separated self, or what Fairburn calls the central area develop, you're just going to have the reactivity from splitting and good or bad. And so you're either terrible or wonderful, and they're terrible or wonderful. But the scapegoat takes on being the terrible object, the bad one, and can be involved in self-protective operations all the time of placating other, and hiding behind that becomes a false. Okay.